Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Cathedral webinar. We are coming to you live on January 13th. You are tuning in today for solar model capacity building, and for your instructors, Mike Stevenson and Stephanie Bostwick. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist at the Native Learning Center. We're also thrilled that you could tune in for the webinar today. If you could follow along as I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law printed here, This is just a friendly reminder that the webinar materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. We do ask that you join with listen-only capabilities. We are recording the webinar. This just helps to cut down on audio feedback. And if you found that your sound is coming out of the wrong device, you can click on the either telephone icon or headset icon on the bottom of your screen, and that'll bring up a list of your speaker devices, and you can select the proper audio output. Even though we ask you to join on mute, we do, of course, still encourage class participation. We want to hear your questions and comments. And we will rely primarily on the public chat to do that. If you don't yet have yours open, you can open it using the messages panel on the left-hand side, and then just type whatever you'd like to say or ask down in the box that says send message to public chat. In the shared notes section, we have a list of helpful links. If you
Hi, everybody. I think we lost Brooke. We'll give her a second to try and
sorry about that, guys.
Okay.
I think we were there for a second. If you guys could just take a moment and introduce yourselves in the chat while we're getting started. You can let us know your name, where you're tuning in from, your work or your role in Indian country, and your tribal affiliation. You might be a tribal employee and not have your own affiliation. That is okay too. All are welcome. And then while you're introducing yourselves in the chat, just try your best to avoid clicking on that menu panel in red all the way to the left-hand side of your screen because it pulls you out of the webinar. While you guys are introducing yourselves in the chat, it's with great pleasure that I introduce your webinar instructors, Mike Stevenson and Stephanie Bostwick. And Stephanie, I have made you presenter now. Oops. Now, sorry about that.
Great. Thanks, Brooke. Welcome, everybody. Oki Niksogoax Nistu Nataniku Ikutsi Aniaki Nim Tutuam Skapi Bigani. Hello, friends and relatives. My name is Stephanie Bostwick. My tribal name is Red Shawl Woman, and I'm Blackfeet. I'm an aerospace engineer by trade and worked on satellite systems for a while before I got into higher education. And I actually started an engineering program at Northwest Indian College focused on renewable energy and energy sovereignty for tribes. And in doing that work, got into a lot of workforce development, training folks through Tarot, through the college, in solar installations, energy audits, solar design, and microgrid feasibility studies as well. So did a lot of work in education and training, and then ended up at the Office of Indian Energy, which is part of the Department of Energy, as the Tribal Colleges and Universities Coordinator. And in that work, that's where I met my colleague Mike here, and we partnered to do a lot of this workforce development and training, particularly with tribal colleges and universities. Mike and I both left the government last year and started kind of our own entity, but our focus has been, again, working with tribes, working with housing, working with tribal colleges, building capacity so that folks can do the work themselves rather than relying on consultants to do everything. And we completely appreciate the need to partner with consultants where needed. But we're just, offering some training that allows people to build capacity internally and hopefully provide more jobs for your folks. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Mike to introduce himself.
Thanks, Steph. Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Stevenson. I'm an electrical engineer. I've had the really good fortune of working with tribes for about the past 12 or 13 years, helping tribes across the lower 48 and Alaska pursue their visions for energy development. Steph and I both took the buyout from Department of Energy, and I founded Energy Solutions coming up on about a year ago now. With the feds, I oversaw the technical assistance the DOE Office of Indian Energy provided to tribes across the lower 48 in Alaska. Spent not quite 6 years with DOE, and prior to that, I had about 6.5 years with the Department of Interior with a small energy office. Some of you may be familiar with the Division of Energy and Mineral Development. While with DEMD, I helped tribes through grants and technical assistance on a variety of different projects, but mostly related to microgrid development and the pursuit of tribal utility formation. As I've said on the last couple of webinars, and still very much, we're incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to partner with the Seminole Native Learning Center on this webinar series, and very much appreciate Georgette, Brooke, and their team dedicating 4 different webinars to energy-related capacity building activities. For those of you that have been on the 2 previous to this one, it's the same kind of sentiment. Steph and I, when we conduct trainings, we're very comfortable being in the room and used to being able to see people's faces to kind of gauge some feedback. And so while we'll certainly have a lot of opportunity to pause for questions, and we're grateful to be able to provide this material to you in this webinar format, we really encourage you to use the chat and interrupt us. We would much prefer to have a discussion around any of these topics in real time, but there certainly will be some time for questions at the end of these sections and at the end of the course as a whole. But really, please don't hesitate to interrupt us. We would much prefer to have the discussion. And thank you all for your time. We really appreciate you being here.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and jump in. This is just a quick overview of what we're going to touch on today. So this is really, if you've got a solar project in mind, whether that be, rooftop solar on a home or, an entire housing development or on an administrative building, this kind of walks you through the process that's, we would consider pre-feasibility, where you're doing a site assessment, you're doing some online modeling. This is really just taking an initial look at everything to come up with a design. But it's enough information for you to put together a grant application and get these projects funded. And we know that, a lot of folks use outside consultants to do this work. But this is something that, people can learn quite easily and do. So this is an opportunity not only to employ your own members, but maybe take somebody who already, if you have an existing grant writer, maybe you're just adding to their skill set for those employment opportunities. But we'll talk through the process, and we'll talk at the end about putting together a grant application using these materials, and then provide some grant resources at the end as well. Great to see everybody in the chat there, all over the place. So again, this need for workforce development and capacity building is just something that we've identified throughout Indian country, throughout our work with tribes. It seems like a lot of folks are relying heavily on external consultants to do a lot of work that tribal folks could be doing. And I think the real importance there is, making sure your own folks are trained and understand this material so that you're making decisions on behalf of your tribe, focused on the goals that you all are focused on. External folks are more than happy to come in and sell you things. And so, we're just here to educate you and let you know that these opportunities exist, because again, this is work that your folks could be doing quite easily. And, if you're paying somebody to do it, you might as well be paying your own people to do it. Not just, another element of energy sovereignty is, having folks internally be able to do that work. Off that soapbox. All right. So Mike's going to give you a quick overview of solar technology before we kind of jump into the process of what we do for the pre-feasibility.
Thanks, Steph. So as Steph mentioned, before we get into the components of the solar capacity building training, we're going to touch a little bit on how the technology works and some general energy education. Solar really is an incredibly unique way to generate electricity, and we'll get into that in a little bit more details in a few slides. Next slide, please, Steph. So we wanted to start with just electricity. I think many people think of transmission and distribution lines as water hoses with electrons waiting to be used, like a light switch opening a faucet. And while a light switch is kind of a faucet that allows electrons to flow to say you have a light hooked up to it, they're not stored in the lines. So electricity has to be consumed the instant it's created. So the instant you turn on a light in your house, you've actually impacted a nearby power plant that has to create more energy for that energy you're consuming. Next slide, please, Steph. And then similarly, we want to talk about power versus energy briefly. So power is the quantity of electricity needed to run a device, and energy is the amount of power consumed over a certain amount of time. So a good example of this, I think most residential microwaves are about 1,000 watts, and 1,000 watts is 1 kilowatt. And so if your microwave ran for an entire hour, it would consume 1 kilowatt hour. So that would be 1 kilowatt hour on your bill if your microwave was running for an entire hour. And putting it in those terms, 1 kilowatt hour is really relatively large amount of power. Power is what your utility company bills you for your monthly usage. Next slide, please, Steph. And then finally, we simply wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't point out that the cheapest kilowatt hour is the one you don't use. New generation is often very appealing, but it's an extremely worthwhile exercise to address energy efficiency before worrying about adding new generation in the form of solar or any other technology for that matter. Okay, so this one I can talk about for hours, and I promise you I won't do that. But, we mentioned solar. It's a very unique way to generate electricity. There's no moving parts in solar panels. And so for many, many, many years, we've generated electricity by harnessing the electric field that's associated with spinning magnets. Again, could we spend a lot of time covering this in our fundamentals of energy course? We are not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but it's important to note that, we have learned that if we put a bunch of wires around basically spinning magnets, we can harness that electric field that's associated with a magnetic field. And that's how most every other technology generates power. So if you have wind power, the wind blows and spins a turbine that's attached to a bunch of magnets. Hydropower, same thing. The hydro turns the water, or the water turns the turbine attached to a bunch of magnets. Fossil fuels, or even clean, if it's geothermal, but like coal, nuclear, natural gas, they all produce steam pressure that in turn spins a bunch of magnets. And solar has none of that. Solar is a very unique way to generate electricity. And so solar, it's made from silicone, which can be characterized is somewhat unstable material in the sense that the photons from the sun actually excite the particles within the silicone and they displace an electron, and we're able to collect those displaced electrons at certain collection points on the panel and use that electricity. So it's incredibly unique way that we're able to generate electricity with no moving parts compared to every other form, whether it be renewable or fossil fuel. Every other form of energy is made by spinning a bunch of magnets. And that'll, I'll get off that little soapbox. So there's a variety of solar technologies. There's a lot of solar thermal, but for today's material, we're going to focus primarily on solar photovoltaic PV technologies. And this is the technology that mostly gets installed on residential and community scale solar projects. Solar works best when the panel is completely perpendicular to the sun. So you want the sun's photons to be able to hit directly on the panel. It provides more of a direct impact. As you can see the picture on the slide on the left, solar panels need to be cleaned. You know, the heat coming off the panels is minimal to the extent that it actually takes quite a long time for them to melt off any snowfall. And any blockage really decreases the amount of energy the panels provide. And that's not just snow on the panel. You know, there's dust, there's dirt on the panels, and cloud cover as well. And even, you know, if you live in a community, which I think more of us are anymore, that's in some sort of are impacted by wildfires, you know, that the smoke, you know, it'll be orange when you step outside in the middle of fire season, and that definitely impacts solar's ability to generate electricity under those conditions as well. And before we move on, the picture on the right actually shows bifacial panels on a carport. And what that means is they make panels that basically can harness energy on either side. So those panels can create energy from the light from the sun on the top of the carport, and they also can produce some excess energy from light that's reflected off of the ground on the underside. Oftentimes people might put white rock or something down to help even magnify the amount of sunlight that's bouncing off the ground to create more energy from those panels. Next slide, please, Steph. And here, we just wanted to cover the scale of projects. Residential is typically just that. Oftentimes it's rooftop, but can certainly be ground mount systems as well to help offset energy on a single home. Community can typically be a solar project that offsets energy usage for multiple homes or facilities. These can be more efficient in terms of cost savings because you're building one larger project versus many smaller ones. Or the bill crediting component of that can be a bit more of a headache as well. And then utility scale is very large projects that are typically have a power purchase agreement with the utility and are purely for revenue generation. But one point that we want to highlight is that grid-tied solar with no energy storage is really simply a way to reduce the cost of your bill. There's no resilience added unless there are batteries attached. When the power goes out, you have zero ability to power your home with just solar panels on the roof. Your power will be out as well unless you have batteries or a backup generator. Next slide, please, Steph. And then we just have here, as part of the fundamentals course, you know, we have an advantage in that we're not trying to sell you any sort of technology. There's truly no free lunch when it comes to creating electricity. Steph and I like to refer to it as the lesser of evils, but there really is good and bad associated with all of the technologies. And our job is to simply inform you of both the good and the bad so you can make informed decisions about which technologies you want to pursue. One of the benefits of solar is it truly works almost anywhere. The technology itself is very well understood and proven. And we know with a good amount of certainty, particularly in the lower 48 states, that we'll get anywhere from a 14 to 20 capacity factor. And what that means is out of all of the hours in a year, the panels will produce electricity between 14 and 20% of the time between 14 and 20% of those hours. Typically, like in the Southwest, has some of the greatest solar resource in the country, and that number is closer to, if not slightly over, 20. And the further you get up north, the closer it gets to about that 14%, primarily due to just the lack of the sunlight hours across the winter months. And again, another advantage is there's no moving parts, so there's less to maintain, but that's also a con of solar. There's no moving parts and there's less to maintain, so there's often not a lot of workforce associated with maintaining these systems long term. And with that, I think we'll get into more of the meat of the capacity building training, but I want to take a second. You can go to the next slide, Steph, and we'll pause to see if anybody has any questions so far. Is there a specific example of this? I think that repair varies. I think that's one of the things with this technology is it's evolving so fast that oftentimes I think that it's the inverters that fail, both on the panels and the larger inverters for the system. We work with a tribe in New Mexico that had a large project, a 1 megawatt solar project, that their inverters failed after, I think it was 6 or 7 years. It was within the warranty time, but GE had no ability to honor the warranty because the inverters that were installed only 6 or 7 years ago were already out of date and they had no ability to fix them. So they had to run new string inverters in. And I think that some of it was covered, but I don't believe the full cost of the equipment added was covered. And the technology to a degree is evolving so fast that even during a regular life period of you're having to replace more major infrastructure than you planned for because that technology is already obsolete. I don't know if I did a great job of answering your question, Kimberly. Let me look. I think, well, the recyclable, I think that was a selling point when solar first started getting put in, is that we'd be able to go through and harness some of the elements from the panel to be reused or recycled in some form or fashion. And I think it's been executed with very limited success. I think now, as the panels have become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, it's less and less cost effective to go into the old panels and change it. I do know that oftentimes people might try and donate panels for other people to find different uses for them. It might not be producing enough power to be used at a power project, and they've changed the panels out. And oftentimes they may look to donate some of the old panels because they still will produce even at 50 or 60% of its life for somebody to be able to repurpose. But that's really the only recycling that I'm aware of. I don't know of any entities. I know there are some folks that are researching it and trying to stand up more sustainable organizations to actually break these panels apart, but I don't think it's been deployed on any level of successful or replicable scale. Do you have anything to add to that, Steph?
I was just going to add, going back to the initial question about repair costs. So panels themselves do tend to have about a 20 to 25-year warranty on them. So if something is happening to the panel themselves, that tends to be covered. But again, as Mike was saying, it tends to be the inverters and other pieces that fail sooner. And, if parts are obsolete, that can become complicated.
And to your last question about making your own solar panels, I think certainly anything's possible. I think that I can't say this, I don't know this to be true. I would suspect that most currently, I know they're probably trying to build up some more local supply chain and capacity to build panels in America. I think for the last dozen or so years, most of even the American built panels are more, it's more accurate to say they're assembled in the US, taking a lot of parts that are still shipped from overseas. But I would suspect it could be challenging to try and even get to a level where you can produce the panels that's competitive with some of the pricing now. The pricing of the panels has really dropped, and it's tough to build a new supply chain and to be able to compete with those economics. Not to say it's not possible. I think the obsolete panels are probably the older generation, like 300-watt panels, and panels that only have one inverter for the panel itself. Many of the panels have different string inverters, and some of them even have an inverter for every like quadrant of like 4 cells. And that really helps the impact, so the panel can still produce electricity when it's shaded. And this is also something we go through in the fundamentals course. We have a mock solar panel. It's a small handheld. I'm using my hands, you can't even see, but it's a 30-watt PV panel that we hook to a bilge pump to be able to pump water from one 5-gallon bucket to another. So you can really see the impacts of panel orientation and shading. You know, we use the box. It's really great when we're able to have the class and we actually have some cloud cover to really see the impact. Even those really wispy, thin clouds really detriment the amount of energy that solar's produced with the panel. And so I think that the newer technologies are a little bit higher wattage with the same footprint, and they also have more inverters installed to help minimize that shading component. Shading being where anything is blocking the sun from penetrating the panel. Whether in the purpose of the course we use a cardboard box to actually see, you know, you only get about 1/10 of the panel covered and it turns off because it's an older style panel that only has one inverter. I think that we'll get into that a little bit later in the lesson. And so pin that question about the models accounting for system degradation, because we'll touch on that with both PV watts, and we also account for that a bit with the financials. And then yes, snow covering panels is definitely a problem. Dirt, like I say, that's really where the cost for workforce is, and it's hardly a full-time job. You know, there's a housing authority we're working with to put residential solar, and as part of the utilities daily tasks, we're talking about putting solar on 86 homes, and they're ground mount systems, and that was intentional because there's space around the house and they have the luxury of having some space that's unused to be able to do it that way, but also so the utility staff can get their hands on and provide maintenance on these systems. And that's being hosing them down in the summertime or figuring out a way to get the dirt and dust off of them, as well as clearing snow in the wintertime. Anything that's on the cover of the panel, you know, helps or prevents really sunlight, those photons from the sun to penetrate. So you want to make sure that the panels are clear if they're going to be producing. Yep, exactly. Thanks, Elron.
These are all super great questions, so we really appreciate everybody engaging. Much rather have this conversation than talk to ourselves and hear ourselves. Yes, and Mike will get into the return on investment part in a little bit as well. So there are calculators that can determine what that looks like, and it's definitely situational because every state has different net metering policies, and those are going to help determine what your payoff period is. But we'll get more into that in a minute. You should be writing our curriculum for us because you're on it. All right, so I'm going to jump into site assessments. So this is kind of the initial step when you've determined you want to put solar on a building or on a site, you need to go into that site and just check everything out before to make sure that it's ready for solar. So we'll jump into that. So this is actually just a photo of the mock roof that we built at Northwest Indian College, but you can see there we've got the rails in place for the solar installation. This is a shingle roof, so we'll talk through different roofing types. But again, with the site assessment, you're going through and making sure that the structure or the ground is ready for the solar installation and you don't have issues with shading and other bits. So the first step is really looking at the roof. If we're going to do roof mount, we want to check the age of the roof. So if you've got a roof that's going to be replaced in the next 10 years, you don't want to go install solar on it. If you know that that solar is good for, 20, 25 years or more, you don't want to have to mount that solar and then pull it off of the roof, replace the roof, and then remount it. And so we are looking at the age and the material of the roof, but also just the basic structure of the home. If it's an older home, we're getting up there and looking at the trusses and making sure that that roof can handle the additional weight. If you've ever lifted one of the panels that goes on a roof, it takes two people typically to carry those things. They're very big and very heavy. So you are adding quite a load to that roof. And so you're making sure that everything is good there. And a lot of times what you can do is do these site assessments and, apply for funding to do the upgrades, and then apply for the funding to do the installation. So it's helpful to go through and do this, even if you know there are going to be upgrades and repairs needed. That can help you access funding to do those repairs prior to the installation. So it's still a good activity to do. The other piece we're looking at is the electrical panel. So we're making sure that it's big enough to handle the solar on the roof. A lot of older homes maybe only have a 100 amp panel. Typically when you're going to install solar, you're going to want at least a 200 amp panel. If you're going and doing those upgrades, you might as well up the system, as big as you can. There is some grant funding for those repairs as well. So it's worth, again, doing that assessment and figuring out what you need. We've talked about heat pumps in other courses, and I think we have more coming up with heat pumps on our next webinar. But if you are adding something like a heat pump, again, having that extra space in the panel is important. So getting those upgrades done can help you with multiple projects. And then Mike kind of talked through the ground mount a little bit. Again, there are different reasons that you might want to look at ground mount. One of them is if you've got a lot of shading on the roof, and maybe there's a space that's more clear and open to the sun that's, away from the home or the structure, that might be a good reason. If you have a house like mine where the roof is sloped to the north, and we'll talk more about my house in a few minutes when we go through the online tool, but my roof is sloped almost totally due north, and that you can still access solar in a roof like that, but it's limited, right? So like if you're, as Mike said earlier, you want that 90-degree angle of incidence from the solar to the panel. And so you're going to get decreased efficiency if you mount solar on a roof that's pointed to the north. East-west can work out really well if it's not shaded, and to the south is usually preferable. So those are reasons you might want to look at ground mount over a roof mount. And then if you have upgrades that are needed to the roof, that's another reason, right? If you don't have the funding in place to do roof repairs, maybe it's easier to go and install a ground mount. The other thing is the tribe Mike was just mentioning, with their ground mount, they're looking to have the adjustable ground mount. And so the tilt angle is actually manually adjustable throughout the year. So in the summer months, our sun tends to be more direct overhead, and you're going to want those panels to be flatter. Whereas in the winter time, the sun's coming in at more of an angle, and so you're going to have more of a tilt on those panels. So if you get the adjustable racking on the ground mount, you can go and adjust that tilt. With a roof, you're basically stuck with whatever that slope of the roof is. You're not going to put racking up there. It's not worth the cost, and it's can add additional problems if you're doing that. So typically, if you want to be able to adjust that angle, you're going to put in a ground mount.
And also, Steph, can I jump in real quick? Sorry.
Yeah.
But
No worries.
that's also why we don't tend to put solar on mobile homes, because they tend to have flat roofs. And so we have to put a racking system on that has the solar at an angle on the roof. And what that ends up doing is acting as for the wind. And it's not even the racking or the solar that we're necessarily concerned about, but we're concerned about that system as a whole getting hit with a wind force that compromises the structural integrity of the mobile home. And that's not just mobile homes. The Pueblo that we've mentioned a couple of times has a lot of traditional houses with flat roofs, both adobe and some newer stucco versions. And you can definitely put solar on a flat roof. You just have to be careful with how you mount the racking and ballast it to the roof without punching any holes in the flat roof. But this tribe in particular made a decision to spend a little bit more on the solar to also not have to worry about their employees getting up on the roof and the liability and things of people getting on snowy roofs. And so there's still a lot of this design that's case by case specific that needs to be thought through. Thanks, Steph.
That's a good question about the ground mount. Typically, if somebody were to touch the surface of the panel, it's not really an issue. But you definitely want to make sure people are, you don't have kids out there playing near the panels, because there is a lot of wiring and other things that could be dangerous. The other thing some people think about when they're doing ground mount is raising it up higher. And that may be due to cattle or other animals coming in and doing different things to potentially, either shade or, disrupt the panels in some way. So some folks will lift them up higher with the ground mount, depending on, what that looks like in that environment. All good questions. Some tools that you're going to need when you do the site assessment, you definitely want to get in there with a camera and take a lot of photos. When we're doing site assessments, it's a little bit invasive, right? We've got to talk to homeowners and get permission to come in. You're going to need attic access. You're going to need access to their main service panel, probably roof access as well, just to climb up there and check everything out. So bringing a camera is good so that you don't have to go out again. You don't want to keep bugging the homeowner and say, oh, we missed something, need to come back and, check this other thing. So just taking a lot of photos so that, when you're going in and doing the whole package of assessment, you've got those photos to show you different pieces. Basic construction stuff, tape measure, ladder, access to the roof, again, access to all the information so that you can take a lot of notes about what is the situation, what is the condition. You're going to need to know the orientation of the roof. You're going to need to know the angle of the roof so that when you do the online assessment, it's accurate in terms of what the potential for solar is. So all of these pieces are really helpful to have. And then the past 12 months of bills as well. That's going to tell you what the actual usage of the structure or home is. And that's where you can figure out how much you're able to offset with either a rooftop system or a ground mount. Other helpful tools, if you have the as-builts for the structure or the home, that can be really helpful just to get a lot of the information about the materials, the age, different locations. Something I probably didn't touch on earlier is like vent and HVAC locations. Those are really important, not only for figuring out where the solar is going to sit on a roof, but those can also provide shading to the panels that we don't want. And so you want to make sure that the solar is situated away from any HVAC or anything else that's going, even a chimney can put shade on the panels that's going to disrupt their ability to produce energy. So understanding where everything is at on the roof is really important. And then you really want to situate the panels so that they're also aesthetically pleasing. And so you don't want to have, a chunk of panels here and a chunk of panels here. You want the layout to be as nice and clean as possible. So understanding where everything's at on the roof is really helpful. There's also a tool called the Solar Pathfinder. This is kind of a manual way of figuring out things like shading and production each month. But again, the online tool that we're going to talk through today is called PV Watts. It's a free tool. It's going to do all of that for you. Basically the same information. So you can use that free tool if you don't have access to a Solar Pathfinder. Any questions so far? Keep typing them in if you have them. So these are just some different types of roofing that folks use. There are a lot of different variations of shingle that you'll see. That's pretty standard on a lot of older homes. Up where I live in the Pacific Northwest, cedar shake is kind of a traditional that they'll put on some of the rooftops. And then there's also composite cedar that some folks will put in. The two that we're starting to see more in, especially in housing, is folks are moving toward metal, which is great. But there are two different types of metal that you can put in. This ribbed panel is called an exposed fastener. And you can actually kind of, if you look really closely here, you can see the fasteners. With this standing seam metal, the fasteners are actually a panhead screw that get covered. So each sheet covers over the fasteners. So there are no exposed fasteners on that metal. But what's really great about standing seam in particular is those rails that you have to mount on the roof that hold the solar panels. Those can actually clip onto those seams. There are little clips that you can buy to do that. And so you're not drilling a bunch of holes in the roof. With the exposed fastener roof, you're still going and drilling into that metal. And yes, all of the bolts and screws have seals on them built in, and, you torque them to the right value, and that's supposed to prevent leakage. But, over time, I've definitely seen some cases where people have mounted on the exposed fastener roofs and seen leakage later on. And so it's kind of minimizing the liability and minimizing, leakage potential in the roof. On the standing seam, you still typically have one hole in the roof that's going down to the main service panel. But I will definitely take one hole over however many, are on an exposed fastener roof, because you're still minimizing that possibility. But with one tribe I've worked with that had the ribbed panel, the exposed fastener, it was really cool when they went to mount the solar. Their roofs were getting kind of older, and they were talking about replacing them. But instead of replacing them, they were actually able to go in and repaint the metal and replace the fasteners. And that was kind of their upgrade. But again, if you have the choice, right, putting in the standing seam and not having to go in and replace every single fastener on a roof when it's ready for repair, you're saving a lot of time and money. So up front, the cost may look like it's higher, but the standing seam metal tends to have like a 25 plus year warranty on it. So, you can put it up there and expect that it's going to last. And again, you're not drilling a bunch of holes in it. So huge fan of that. If you're thinking about installing solar, it's really worth that upfront cost to minimize that damage. Right. So again, there are a couple different free solar resource assessment tools. They were developed by the National Renewable Energy Lab, which has now been rebranded the National Lab of the Rockies. So far, their NREL links still work, but if in the future you go to one of these two sites listed, either the pvwatts.nrel.gov or the sam.nrel.gov, I don't know if they're going to change those to NLR in the future, but for now they're still at those sites, but you can Google it. The recording of this will be available afterward, and I think it's a Brooke question if the slides are available separately, but we'll let her chime in with that.
I think we lost her again, potentially.
Oh, okay.
I think she makes the slide deck available, but oh, never mind. There we go.
There it is. All right, slides are right there. So these are the two tools that you can use, and in a minute we'll walk through how to walk through the PV watts to do a basic assessment on a home. The system advisor model one, they actually have videos on that site that kind of walk you through how to use it. It's a little bit more complex than PV watts, but what's nice is they've got other types of resources built in, like geothermal and wind and battery. And so you can do a little bit more with that one. But if you're just looking at solar, I would recommend using PV watts. It's pretty easy to use. It's pretty user-friendly. But that one's available as well if you're looking for that. So in the beginning of the site assessment, I mentioned collecting 12 months of energy bills, whether that's a residence or your administrative building or whatever else. Having that 12 months of bills is going to tell you what your annual usage is, and it's going to help you understand how much of that you can offset using solar. Again, your net metering policies are going to play in, your policies with interconnecting with the utilities. Some utilities really limit the size of the system that you can interconnect. So even if you've got a roof that could hold, 400 kilowatts of solar, you're probably not going to find a utility in this country that's going to let you connect a system that's that big up to them. So it's important that you understand that as well, but understanding your 12 months of consumption will help you make those calculations. And we are going to look at, in the next slide, seasonal load versus base load. So base load is really everything in your home that's not your heating and cooling. It's kind of what you're going to use every day regardless of the season. That seasonal load is your heating and your cooling. So in some areas, where maybe they don't have air conditioning, maybe the summer load's a little bit less because they're just, operating a couple box fans or nothing at all. And in the winter, you're doing a lot of heating. But that seasonal load is going to vary depending on where you are in the country and what type of appliances you're using and whether they're electric or gas. And you can do these same calculations whether you're looking at an electrical bill or a gas bill. And in doing that, you can kind of calculate, again, your potential savings in both dollars and kilowatt hours based on the system that you design, either rooftop or ground mount. That can really help you make decisions about what systems you want to tackle first, whether that's your housing units or, again, if you've got administrative buildings, cultural centers, things like that you want to go after first. Analyzing these bills is really going to help you look at that. All right, so some of the basic calculations you can do with that bill. Apologies, this is like the fine print, so testing everybody's eyes here, but here's 12 months of usage. And if you look at the plot here, that orange section at the bottom, that's the base load. So that's, again, everything on a daily basis, no matter what month of the year it is, that's kind of what you're using each month in electricity. And then over here you can see, so these are kind of more the winter months, that's the heating load. And then in the summer months, you can see kind of a lower cooling load there. So again, understanding the difference between what's your base load and what's your heating and cooling, that can, going back to energy efficiency measures and potentially installing a heat pump, these are all ways to identify reductions, because if you've got a really high load, what you're going to try to do is reduce that load so that you don't need as much solar to compensate. And so if you're able to do energy efficiency measures or somehow reduce what your usage is before you install solar, that's going to help you save money and not having to put as many panels up to do that. So going into the base load calculation first, what you're going to do is look at that 12 months and find the 3 lowest numbers. You can use, calculator on your cell phone or use Google to do the math. You're adding the lowest 3 months together, dividing by 3, and then multiplying by 12. That's going to give you that number here that we're seeing as the base load. And then for the seasonal load, you're taking that whole 12 months and adding them together. And once you subtract the base load, what that leaves is that seasonal load, those peaks that you're seeing there for heating and cooling. You can also do an energy index calculation. That helps us just standardize, regardless of the size of the home. You're incorporating the square footage, you're dividing by your square footage in that calculation. And so that really says, per square foot, regardless of the size of the home, this is how many kilowatt hours we're using per year. So you could compare a 5,000 square foot home to a 1,000 square foot home by standardizing it there and saying, this is the kilowatt hours I'm using per square feet per year. That way you're not going into a bigger home and saying, oh, this usage is really excessive. I mean, if you've got a big home and you've got 5 people living in it, maybe it's not excessive. But that just helps us standardize it so you can compare 2 structures to one another and look at efficiency from that lens. The effective cost per kilowatt hour is really just incorporating your fees, taxes, and other things. So maybe your utility tells you you're paying 8 cents per kilowatt hour, but maybe you're really paying 12, once you incorporate your fees and everything. And again, that can go into the calculations that help us determine payback. Any questions on the billing or anything with the site assessments so far? Again, feel free to keep typing in the chat if you have questions. It's a lot of math here. So going back to the tools, we're going to just walk through a quick PV watts. So again, if you go to pvwatts.nrel.gov, it's going to pull up a screen that looks just like this. If you want to try this out, you can always, again, come back and rewatch the webinar or just pull up the slides so you don't have to hear me talking. But you can pull that up and walk through this later on. But the first thing you're going to do is you can either put in an address or you can put in a city and state. My house is in Bellingham, Washington, so that's what I typed in here for this example. And I'll show you my rooftop and some of my issues, but that'll kind of help you see how this tool works and can help you analyze if solar is right for your home. So you're going to start by just putting in that address and clicking on Go, and that'll take you to the next screen that looks like this. And when you get to this screen, it's just kind of telling you, oh, this is the latitude and longitude of the location you chose. Great. And then you're just going to click on the Go to the System Information button here. And that'll take you to this screen. So there are a couple of different things that we're going to look at on this screen. The first thing we're going to do, whatever your address you typed in, this map is going to zoom in on that location. So if you click on this map, it's going to take you to that address. Now, if you live in a place where your addresses don't align with Google, it's probably just going to take you to the general vicinity, and then you can kind of move the map around to get to the location. We've worked with a lot of tribes where you kind of have to just get to the basic city, and then, you know, you have to know where to look for the different home or structure that you're looking at. But you can, it's got Google Maps built in, so you can kind of zoom around and find the home that you're looking for there. So the first thing we're going to do is just click on that. So again, this is my house. I live on a half acre that's full of trees. So you cannot see my whole rooftop here. It is a rectangle. It's 30 by 36 feet. But you can see there right in front of my house, I've got a 500-year-old Doug fir that's not going anywhere. So she's the reason I don't have solar on my roof. But when you get to this spot and you can see your roof, what you're going to do is just click in a counterclockwise direction each corner of the roof. So I started by clicking this corner, this one, and then I came over at an angle just because, again, you can't even see my roof over here. You're not going to include that as a spot where you would put solar. So this is just calculating the square footage, or in this case, it does square meters. It does the size of the roof that you've selected. And this actually gives you a guesstimate of what you can put on there for system size. So you can see there that for the roof area I've selected, it's going to be about a 10 or 10.5 kilowatt hour system that goes in there. And so when you go in and do that rooftop, it's going to figure out the square footage or square meters of that. And it's going to, based on the location, it's going to determine how much solar capacity you have. So once you do that rooftop selection, you're going to click save. That's going to take you back to that previous screen where I said there are some other options you want to look at. So the default here is always going to be fixed open rack. That means ground mount system. And so the next selection down is going to be fixed roof mount. That's what you're going to want to select if you are doing a roof mount system versus a ground mount. The system losses have a lot of estimates already built into them. So the default tends to be pretty accurate. I don't think you're going to get a whole ton better of an estimate by trying to update your system losses unless you think they're extremely, low or high for your area. But you can kind of leave that one alone. And then the tilt angle here, you can see it's 20 degrees. That's the default, but that's actually, my home actually is a 20-degree slope, which is cool. It's already the default there. And then the default for orientation is 180 degrees. That's due south. So that's assuming that your roof is sloped to the south. So again, as I mentioned, my roof is actually sloped to the north. It's about 10 degrees. But what I'm going to do is show you the result that this will give you for my house. And then I'll show you the result for what my house actually looks like, sloped 10 degrees to the north versus, direct to the south. And it really changes what your solar estimate is for generation. So here is with the default. So assuming my roof was pointed to the south and sloped at 20 degrees, it's telling me that I could get about 11.1 kilowatt hours, or 11.1 thousand kilowatt hours per year from that system. And you can see here that it's estimating my solar radiation, and that's dependent on the month. So what you're going to see is in the winter months, you're going to see these really small numbers, like 1 or smaller. And you're going to see, especially in my neck of the woods, in August, September, when we've got these really long days, that's when we're going to have the most generation potential because our days are much longer. And this is, again, just giving me an estimate for the year based on that orientation. That's going to change drastically, again, if my roof is pointed in a different direction. Also, you need to take shading into account and other things as well. But I will show you, this is the graph for how my roof is oriented. So to 10 degrees to the north with a 20-degree slope, the numbers are much smaller here. So on the previous one, it was like 1.2 or something like that. This is 0.4. So you can see that in January, I'm getting a much lower number. So in every month, you're going to see those numbers be smaller. So I could still, put solar on my roof, but the numbers are going to be much smaller. And again, with my trees, the shading is really going to affect that. So it's really not going to be worth it in my case. But this is just showing you those numbers really decreasing with that roof slope to the north instead of to the south. So if I turned my house 180 and had it kind of pointed at 190 to the south, you can see the numbers get much higher here. So, if I was on the same spot with just that slope change, if I completely turned my house around, I would no longer get the light that I get from the south in all my windows, but I would have a better slope roof for solar potential. So this is just kind of an example to show you how to walk through that. It's going to look different in different places. If you're at a similar latitude, you might see, a similar graph for your area. If you're farther south, you're going to see higher potential in all of the months. But really, you are going to see your peaks still in the summertime when you've got the longer daylight hours than you do in the winter. All right. Any questions?
I know there was a question earlier about the losses or system degradation, and as Steph touched on, the defaults that are in there are pretty good. I usually caution folks that this is a tool that was created by the National Renewable Energy Lab. So there's definitely some bias in there, and they're a bit optimistic. And we'll talk on it a little bit when we get to our financial analysis tool, that we kind of counteract that by having a more conservative financial output. That factors in all sorts of your efficiency losses through the inverter and having to convert to AC energy. That calculates all the system degradation over time. And again, each of those, in my opinion, are a little bit optimistic, but the best we can do is kind of predict. We can't really predict these weather anomalies, these fire seasons that can be prolonged, that are definitely going to impact the ability of the panels to generate electricity. And so for what the tool is for, and particularly in this case where you're just applying to be able to get a grant to put the solar on, it's definitely a very close representation. It's in the same ballpark. Again, I think it's probably on the higher end of what you could really expect, but it's definitely not worth actually changing any of the settings for the degradation. Just know it's a bit optimistic. Oh, and I guess that gets into me anyways. And so, as Steph brought up and highlighted, reasons that we see this as an opportunity for tribes to be able to bypass having to get federal funding for feasibility and go through that whole cycle of a year plus to be able to get the feasibility dollars to pay for a consultant to help do this work. Because solar is relatively easy to assess. We can be pretty confident in the amount of power the panels will produce over their lifetime. And, there's other considerations, as Steph brought up. Oftentimes the roof size is a limiting factor, and we have to take into account the shading of the panels. But really, where many of these projects are either stood up or fall apart is the utility net metering policy. That's really what tends to determine how viable a solar project really is. Next slide, please, Steph. So what is net metering? Well, it's a utility arrangement that lets a solar customer use the electric grid essentially as a virtual battery, and what does that mean? Well, when you produce more energy than you consume, this energy flows to the grid and you're credited for it. And the key here, and it varies, it's different everywhere, is how much you're credited. And, you know, we'll dive into that in a bit deeper in a couple of slides, but it's varying and it's changing all of the time. These utilities are getting pretty sophisticated in their rate structures. And again, we'll dive into that in a couple of slides. Next stuff. So here is an example of net metering. There's a lot of numbers here, and I questioned when I made this slide if it was going to be more helpful or more confusing than the effort, and I'm hoping it's more helpful than confusing. But we can also discuss this at the end if there's more, or do even further in-depth one-on-one phone calls to understand what the net metering might look like with your utility and your situation. But for this example, you know, say your house uses 1,000 kilowatt hours in a month and your solar project generates 800 kilowatt hours. Well, unfortunately, the solar power doesn't just generate power when you need it, right? And so in this example, I think we have the home using 500 kilowatt hours during the daylight hours and 500 kilowatt hours at night. We just tried to simplify it for this demonstration. And so because the solar generates 800 kilowatt hours, you're exporting 300 kilowatt hours back to the grid. And in a situation where the grid gives you retail credit, meaning for every kilowatt hour you send back in the middle of the day, if you use one at night, they basically cancel each other out. And that's the perfect situation for rooftop solar. More and more utilities are getting away from that model, but that's the entire perfect situation, because then of that 500 kilowatt hours you bought from the grid when the sun wasn't shining, you get credit for the 300 that you exported, and now your energy bill is only 200 kilowatt hours. And that's a perfect example of how the older legacy net metering that still exists in some places, but like I say, if you're not being able to build a project to get grandfathered into it, I doubt there's going to be many utilities still giving full retail credit for electricity produced by solar projects in the next 5 years even. They're rapidly changing their policies. Next slide, please, Steph. So all credits are not created equal, right? They're changing all of the time. Some utilities still do give retail credit, meaning you can use that energy at night at the same rate they compensated you for energy you sent when the sun was shining. It's very ideal. And some utilities even allow you to bank your credits for a whole calendar year, which is very helpful, particularly some tribes we work with in places like Eastern Washington, where they have heating and cooling loads, and you're able to, but it's mostly electric heat, and you're able to bank some of those summer hours to be able to use to help offset those winter loads. And utilities have kind of realized that they're acting as free batteries and absorbing this cost and determined it to be unsustainable. And so they've started shifting their policies to where it's pretty frequent now to see that utilities will provide credits for net metering, but they don't let you carry it a full year. They'll reconcile the credits that month. And so it still can be very viable for solar projects. It just becomes a little bit different how we have to consider the size of the panels you put on the roof, because we're not able to bank a bunch of summer hours to be used in the winter time. But each state and even each utility within a state often has very differing policies. So this is truly, it's vastly different everywhere. You know, I think that we have an example later in the presentation where we'll discuss in a lot greater detail some of the compensation from a tribe we recently worked with that's in PG&E's service territory in California. I don't know if we have any California friends on with us today, but some of those investor-owned utilities out there have very unfavorable net metering policies. The latest iteration, their net metering 3.0, and we'll go into that in a little bit greater detail after we get through some of the financials. Is there any questions on net metering before we get into the financial tool? Okay. So when it comes to writing a competitive solar grant application, or even if you're interested in investing your own funds in a project, clearly the financials play a huge role. And this slide shows a snapshot from a summary page of a tool we recently created for a tribe in Northern California. It displays the size of the project, expected energy generation, expected savings based off of credits or lack of energy bought from the utility, the cost of the system, the simple payback, which is simply taking the overall cost and dividing by the annual savings. And it also takes into account the net present value. And so NPV is important to consider because NPV is a financial concept used to evaluate whether a project is worth doing by comparing today's value of money spent to today's value of money received in the future. Your dollar will never have any more buying power than it does today. The buying power decreases over time. And so that's accounted for in this financial tool to be able to kind of compare apples to apples and see if it's really a viable project worth pursuing. And we calculate that by, again, this is where our model is a bit conservative, and I'll talk to it a little bit in the next couple of slides as well. But we do this by taking into account estimated utility rate increases and also the future inflation of the dollar. And also this again is great information to put in a grant application. We certainly know and understand that these projects are much more than just financial considerations. It may be a step closer to resilience or energy sovereignty, and it may be worth it to the tribe to pursue a project, even if the net present value is not favorable. It's not just purely a cost benefit component. But again, this is another example of making sure that the tribe and tribal leadership have the proper information at their hands to make an informed decision on whether they do want to proceed with the project, even if it's maybe slightly unviable financially. So the net metering policies clearly play a huge impact on the financial component of solar project development. We build a custom financial analysis tool for tribes to use as they proceed with solar feasibility in the future. Embedded within the tool are links for some of the assumptions made, dollar per watt for solar projects, etc. And we attach links for all of those assumptions so it can be updated, and hopefully it's a tool that's used for multiple, if not many years to come. Again, the assumptions typically pretty conservative, and not out of the ballpark, not obscenely conservative, but we would much rather underpromise and overdeliver than have a really rosy, optimistic financial report that the project underperforms expectations. Next slide, please, Seth. Thanks. And so the tool only needs solar resource information taken directly from PV watts. On a few slides back that Steph showed where it had the solar radiation and then also the estimated energy generation off of that information. I'll show you, there's a picture and a couple slides down, I think, if not the next one, where that information gets added into this tool, as well as utility bill information, usage and dollar per kilowatt hour, and it calculates the rest for you. And so again, I covered this information on the intro slide, but the financial analysis tool outputs pertinent information needed to help support a really competitive grant application. And here's the picture I was talking about. So this is a picture taken from the tool that we created for the tribe in Northern California, that where the user inputs all the solar resource data directly over from PV watts, and it makes one of the graphs that Steph had created on showing the output of her house, but it outputs a graph for you too to be able to see the solar radiation by month for that particular location. And so here, so this is the slide I referenced earlier about PG&E compensation. And so we were approached by a tribe in PG&E service territory interested in looking at rooftop solar. And digging through some of the net metering 3.0 policy, they compensate real time for energy sent back to the grid. And the compensation varies anywhere from like a fraction of a cent per kilowatt hour. There's even points, I can't remember the exact dates. I think there's like 1 or 2 weeks in September from like 6 to 8 p.m. where it actually gives back like $2 and some change per kilowatt hour. But it's not enough to where the level of sophistication you would need for controls to export at that time, plus the size of the system, it's not even worth considering. You know, I think when you take all of these 576 discrete payments that they compensate you, depending on which hour of the day and which month of the year, and even day of the week, I think they split it up between week and weekend. It's incredibly complex and very hard to predict when the solar panel is going to be over generating in this time frame. And so I think on average, it's about 5 or 6 cents that they pay for power. And then they turn around and charge you anywhere from 41 to 61 cents per kilowatt energy you're consuming from the grid. So you're losing up to 55 cents for each kilowatt hour you exported. So in this scenario, we neglected to account for any compensation from the grid, and we just consider it icing on top of the cake. Any compensation that's sent back from solar generated, and we recommended adding energy storage to keep all of that solar generation at the home, because for them, since they're compensated so poorly by the utility, it is their benefit to harness all of that solar energy at the house and use it in the night when it's needed. So you're not paying 41 or 61 cents per kilowatt hour. The issue with that is energy storage is very expensive. And so without grant funding, even offsetting 40 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour, it's very far from being financially feasible. Now there's other scenarios, you know, if you're trying to fight against a public safety power shutoff, or there's other reasons for completing this project. But in this situation, it's very difficult to pencil a rooftop solar project, which, as we've discussed in multiple different areas, the real primary goal of rooftop solar without energy storage is to help your members save money on their monthly bill. And it simply doesn't work under this California net metering 3.0. And I fear that these are going to replicate that model instead of trying to find some middle ground that works for both the utility and the solar customer. But I could get on a soapbox about that, and I won't.
All right. Any questions? Well, I will start to talk through the summary, but if some questions come in, we'll definitely answer. Oh, there we go. State or federal solar rebates. So the federal rebates are, I think, basically over. State by state, you can definitely look into it, but I don't know of any in my state right now for rebates. And for the near term, federal funding is not going to be able to cover renewable energy as far as we know. You know, hopefully that will come back in future administrations. But certainly for now, funding is tight, especially when it comes to renewable projects, unfortunately. There are some private funding opportunities out there from some nonprofits that we'll cover here at the end.
I do know too that There's a lot with the tax rebates. I don't know if you're planning to attend the Seminole conference at the end of the month. Peyton Batliner will be there with Native American Bank. He's a good resource to understand how tribes are able to utilize some of the tax credits. And same with, I know Joel Lobenstein, I know Baker Tilly's done a lot of work in that area as well. I don't know a ton about the tax credit components of it, but I do know that some of that funding has been able to be recovered recently, but a lot of those projects I think are already built, and I'm not sure if the sunset's already passed for being able to build new projects and take advantage of those programs. And Archie, I love the question, and I'm so grateful you asked it, because there's another soapbox. I think people greatly underestimate the time interconnection takes, and there's consultants out there that are more than happy to take a government grant, build you a solar project, and not have it connected to anything. And now it's Art Deco in the desert or Art Deco in the plains while you're trying to figure out how to get this thing connected so it can actually be a viable project for your community. I really encourage getting the utility on board with the project sooner than later. It's best, if you're worried about the utility and interconnection policies, to be able to understand what their published policies are and keep it within their published policies. There's very little they can really do to stop it. Now, tribes do have a lot of leverage to be able to put projects in place that are over their published rates, and I've seen that happen with some TCUs and other projects across the country. But it takes time. Then it takes time and review, and it's definitely something where you want to get the utility on board early on when you know that the project's going to happen, if not before, to ensure a smooth interconnection process, because these utilities can and will drag their feet, and the last thing you want is membership thinking you've got a solar project and it's been 3 years before it finally actually gets attached to anything and is generating any sort of cost savings for you. And it happens all too frequently. I mean, there's several projects I know of that a consultant came in and took the money and built a very great project, but it's not benefiting the tribe because everybody neglected to go through the interconnection process at the right time.
All right, so keep typing questions. I'm just going to give kind of a brief summary. So again, everything that we've covered is kind of enough to put together a grant application package, whether you're going for federal or private funding dollars. So you are going to want kind of a summary of those site assessments that you did and any findings. So maybe you went through and did 50 site assessments and you found that, you need to upgrade all of your panels to 200 amp panels. Or maybe you need to do some roof replacements or repairs before you come in and do those solar installations. But having that summary, again, can help you get funding to do those upgrades as well. But it also shows folks that you kind of did that initial analysis and you know where you're at and what needs to be done before the solar can be installed. Having that 12 months of usage is really critical, again, for, the financials and showing the cost savings and the payoff of this system. And that PV watts output is, something you're going to want to include in the grant application to show what that rooftop potential is, right? Your size limited by the rooftop and, how much you can potentially put up there. But if you put in there the actual orientation and slope and shading of the roof, that's really going to help you show, hey, this is a viable option, or, maybe ground mount is a better option for that specific site. And then going back to Mike's calculator, showing that simple payback period so that it looks like a viable option, especially when it comes to federal funding. Anything to add, Mike?
No, I don't think so. Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk through a few available resources. this is not all encompassing. There are a ton of resources out there for grants. And again, if you're interested in things like rebates, I would look at the state level, look at your state energy office to figure out what's available, not only for rebates, but they're going to have information about your net metering policies as well, and may even have some grant funding opportunities available. I know in Washington State, the Washington State Department of Commerce is where our energy office is housed, and there still tend to be grant opportunities available for tribes to do solar installations and other energy projects. So definitely check with your state if you're interested. But we'll walk through a few other opportunities. So again, Mike and I used to work for the Office of Indian Energy. They do offer planning and deployment grants. We expect those to come out sometime in the spring. It's really going to be dependent on the federal funding, the budget getting approved. So we do expect that to come out sometime in the spring and be available. If you're in the planning phase, you know, definitely apply for a planning grant, but they've also got deployment opportunities. Currently, we don't think that's going to be able to fund things like solar and wind and battery, but things like heat pumps are probably going to be on the table. We won't know for sure until it comes out. And there are some internal debates happening, especially related to tribes specifically, to try to get the renewables to stay on the table. Technical assistance with the office is free. All you have to do is go to their website, click to apply for free technical assistance. You send an email saying this is what we want help with, and they'll give you 40 hours of free pre-feasibility technical assistance, and that can be really helpful if you're just getting started. And then they've got newsletters. Their newsletters are not going to totally clutter your inbox. They only come out, you know, when they've actually got relevant information to share. So that's worth signing up for. And then the BIA, the office that Mike used to work for, also offers a couple of pre-feasibility grants. One's called EMDP and the other is TEDC. So check those out as well if you're interested in kind of pre-feasibility studies and getting those funded. And then in terms of private funding, we've done a lot of work with Tribal Energy Alternatives, formerly Grid Alternatives tribal program. They offer 4 different grant opportunities that are listed there. If you're interested in things like capacity building, they've definitely funded a lot of our work, you know, training tribes to do things like energy audits, strategic energy planning, things like that. So the capacity building grant is great for that, but their facility and residential project is great for actual solar installations. But they also have a gap fund. So if you've got something that requires a cost match, they can fill in that cost match for you to help fully fund a project. And they've got planning grants as well. And then Native Learning Center, obviously very grateful for these webinar opportunities, but they also offer technical assistance that can help with on-site training. They cannot pay for equipment, but if you are interested in some on-site training, please reach out to NLC. And we can potentially work with you all doing some on-site trainings through that mechanism as well.
Kyle, to answer your question, that's a great question, and it's very situational. I guess it depends on the size of the project that you're considering, and if consultants on place and whether or not trust kind of. My recommendation would be, as a first start, going to the utility's website, and they should have all of the interconnection policies available online. Some of this, even the smaller co-ops, might not have such a robust website, but they should have all of the tariffs publicly posted, as well as their interconnection policies and the sizing posted, and kind of overlay what that process looks like. If you're looking to build a project that's beyond what they have publicly available, this is more time consuming, and you get into that kind of federal cycle of grants. But as Steph mentioned, the TEDC grant from the BIA, that grant program was originally moved to the office I worked for in 2014, and we left it fairly open-ended, and it was intended for tribes as they pursued terras, and it was all about being able to expedite permitting, and tribes really seized on that funding and made a market that we weren't even aware of at that point in time, and really have leveraged that funding to pursue tribal utility formation activities. And that doesn't mean you need to use the funding to be able to get to where you have a pole and wire electric utility, but there's great value in even doing a preliminary study with an Indian energy legal expert to help kind of analyze past billing, where there are state taxes that were being charged that never should have been charged, understanding if your easements are all current or if you've got rights of way and trespass, and any little bits of leverage could be very beneficial to be able to be bargaining chips for being able to bring a larger scale size on online. And there's certain little points of leverage that I'd say probably, by the time I left that office, had probably 60 grants over 5 years, and more than 2/3 of the tribe thing that was wrong historically with billing, and added some leverage to be able to use as a bargaining chip to help bring some project, or however they decided they wanted to move that chip off the board, so to speak. That could be a beneficial resource, but I think it starts with going online and looking up the information. And Steph and I would be happy to get on a call with you too and talk through specific, navigate that if that's useful for you. Please don't hesitate to contact us.
In terms of the T question, I'll answer that one real quick. T actually is still funding those grants that I mentioned. Solar for All was a separate bucket of money, so they are not doing that, but the 4 listed they are doing. Mike and I are actually currently working on a few different projects with folks that have been funded in the most recent round of T funding. So they do open those annually. I want to say it was maybe last May that we submitted applications for some of the capacity building efforts and planning. So those should be coming open again, despite the Solar for All. And Brooke answered Serena's question. If you want to just shoot an email to Brooke about the TA with NLC. And apologies for going a couple minutes over, but really appreciate all of the good questions. Oh, yeah. Our contact information is also important.
Like Steph mentioned, we really appreciate everyone's time today. Apologies for going a bit long. Please don't hesitate to contact us via your phone or email if you have any questions at all. This is what we do. We're happy to get on a call with you and just kind of walk through what you're seeing and what resources might be available. And if you want to partner with us on a grant, if not, we're certainly still happy to be resources to help you navigate whatever particular project you're trying to advance.
Thank you so much for another amazing webinar, Mike and Stephanie. Feel free to keep asking your questions in the chat, folks. I'm just going to go ahead and close out while y'all are doing that. I did put a link to today's webinar feedback survey in the chat for you. Just lets us know what's working well and what we can improve upon. Watch out, Penelope. It is completely anonymous, so no worries about your email or your name being attached to it. We hope you could join us for our next webinar coming up on this Thursday. Sorry, guys, I'm homesick. This will be an update on urban native housing with Shelly Tucciarelli. Same time as the webinar today. All our webinars are going to be at 2 p.m. On Tuesdays and Thursdays. So that'll be Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Pacific, or 10 a.m. Alaska. We hope you can check out our other recorded webinars. They're on our YouTube channel on the Cathedra webinar archive. And feel free to check out our other upcoming training events. We post about them on our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And then otherwise, that is all we have for you today, folks. I'm going to keep it open for anybody who is continuing to ask questions in the chat. All those links that have been mentioned are either in the webinar slides, which are linked in the shared notes, as well as in the public chat. And then that webinar feedback survey is also in the chat for you. But there's several more links in that shared notes section if you want to take a look at those as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording, but I'm going to keep the session open for questions and for links.